Greetings, I'm James Fallows of the U.S. Studies Center at the University of Sydney and the Atlantic magazine in the United States. It's my great pleasure today to welcome my friend and my colleague and my teacher, Walter Russell Mead, who's known to readers across the world and in Australia for his current association with the American Interest magazine and for his very influential and prolific blog via Medium, for his role at Bard College. Before that, many years, how many years at the Council on Foreign Relations? 12 years, and one of the founding fathers and board members of the New America Foundation, and the author of many books that have made a big difference in how Americans and people around the world think of U.S. power, including Special Providence, Mortal Splendor, and many others. With that preface, I'd be fascinated, as somebody where my own background is in monthly magazines, The Atlantic, and some books, and I've recently been working in the digital media. How did you become so much a man of the blogosphere? How did you decide to do this? What were the stages of evolution, and what do you now like and not like?
You know, before I started blogging, I guess there were several years, every now and then I'd think, gee, I wonder if I should blog. And it always seemed like an awful lot of work. But it's one of those ideas that just once you start thinking about it, it doesn't go away. And I found that more and more often when I was finding something that was interesting, it was actually in blogs. Mm-hmm. So finally I thought, okay, fine, I'll just give it a try. And actually before I started blogging, I spent about a month sort of writing dummy things to get some idea of did I like it or not. It was a natural thing to want to blog at the American Interest. It's a magazine that Frank Fukuyama started some years ago with a group, and I've gotten involved with them. So they were willing to host a blog if I was willing to write one. And you know, it's addictive. I find anyway that I am more excited about blogging now than I was when I started. It's given me a chance to sort of explore ideas, and I'm starting to see much more how they fit together, how they hang together. I can see books coming out of this. So I think in some ways blogs are a way of sharing your first drafts. Right. It's sort of, you convene a large study group and you get a lot of comments. But also, and this was one of the things that got me to the tipping point, I started looking at the history of English letters. Wow. And you know, I look at something like The Spectator that Addison and Steele put out in early 18th century London. It was a blog. Yeah. They had sort of, you know, came out about 3 times a week. It was informal. It was, you know, it was very much different from the straight-laced, very formal literature of the day. It was chatty. And they used the highest tech available. That is, the writer would write it, it would be taken down to the printing press and immediately set in print and distributed with the penny post, you know, the sort of highest tech available means of distribution. And it was incredibly influential. You look at Samuel Johnson's Rambler, or for that matter, the Federalist Papers were a blog. They were written, again, 3 posts a week, Hamilton, Jay, they're just getting them out there. So actually, I think that in terms of the history of English letters, actually you could even say Montesquieu, you could talk about Western letters, that the short personal essay is the key form of persuasion and communication for the last 200 years. And I think the blog revitalizes that. So I think we're going to see more and more people who are established and, you know, in other ways dabble in the blogosphere. And for at least a percentage of it, I think it's going to become a major outlet.
You a couple times you said, we do this or that on the blog. Could you describe your work unit and how it operates?
I mean, some of that is just the imperial editorial we, but it's, I have a research assistant, Peter Melgard, and then the staff at the American Interest print magazine works with us too. And what we do is sort of every day we talk about what's going on in the world. Once a week we kind of get everybody involved. We have interns, you know, I may go on a recruiting tour of Australia to try to dig up some interns there. A lot of them are undergrads or recent graduates who sort of work. We have a kind of a vision paper that everybody looks at. And so people then draft ideas for posts that they see, send them in. They, the editors look at them, and then I look at them and basically, paint in the eyes, so to speak, or something like reject it or change it. Sometimes it's just perfect and it goes in as it is.
I have one other question about your operation in the new digital age. Something I found fascinating and valuable in my experience at the Atlantic's website is just being able to hear from a diaspora of people all around the world with new information. And could you tell, since we're talking to a non-US audience, about the kinds of feedback you've gotten internationally and ways in which that's changed your opinion or given you awareness of things you might not otherwise have had?
Well, I should say that actually one thing, I have a lot of readers in Australia, in fact, and on Asia stuff, Australian readers often are a couple of beats ahead of the US audience. And I've actually learned, whether it's the Lowy Institute or some of the newspapers in Australia, so we keep a weather eye on that coverage. But we get a lot of comments. For example, when I write about Pakistan, I get a lot of comments from Pakistan and from India, and that actually tells me a lot. How something you say is received in these places really makes you think much harder. Blogging is a much more interactive, much less autistic form of writing than sort of being the hermit in your mountain cell, because people are very, if they got a comment, they'll comment.
Yeah. And I don't remember right now, do you allow comments on you do have comments on your site, yes.
We curate the content. Yes. We are very anal about our
because otherwise it's Gresham's Law.
That's right. So what we try to do is limit all naughty words, and even words that your grandmother thought were naughty. We sort of overkill that way, but I think it's good.
You are a preacher's son, after all.
Exactly right. So if my grandmother wouldn't have said it at the dinner table, it won't be on our blog. But also, we try to limit just how vicious the commenters are to each other. They get a little more latitude attacking me.
Because you're a big guy.
Well, it's kind of like, if you can't fling a handful of dirty, rotten stuff at the guy who's speaking, what's the point?
Let me ask you now about a couple of the areas you've written about in the last, on your site and your books over the years. There are two basic ways to view the social and political tensions in China. One is it's tense, and it always has been and always will be. The other is something fundamental is changing that threatens the last 30 years of control, last 60 years of control. Which of those camps would you be closer to?
Well, I'd have one foot squarely in each. Yeah. That is, I think, here's the thing. I think that China is riding a bicycle on a tightrope. And in a sense, the more successful they are, the more difficult it is to keep going. So that, now when you think of, how does the Chinese government make policy? Well, it has to balance all kinds of international trade issues, the housing market, the interest rate. There's sort of more things on the plate. And then people are worried about air pollution in Beijing and quality of local officials in Wuku, all of these things. So it's juggling more and more balls. Now they're very, very good at what they do. But I think there is a limit to how many balls anybody can juggle. And some of the problems they have, that is sort of a one-party system, doesn't get a lot of feedback. The problem of corrupt local officials or power abuse, the fact that local officials' income are tied to things like land sales and so on, that and the local officials are in a position to go to the local bank and sort of make the bank do certain kinds of lending, regardless of what the emperor says 1,000 miles away in Beijing. And so as China becomes more dynamic, it becomes harder to govern.
And the implication of everything you're saying for Australian or American or Western policy is continued engagement as thoroughly as possible with China, or anything other than that?
Yeah, well, I first of all, we have, it seems to me, nothing to gain from trouble in China or Chinese failure. All of the problems that one associates with a rising China are less ugly than the problems of a China that was unhappy, distressed, and in turmoil. So, clearly the way forward for us is to try to deepen relationships. geopolitically, there's a certain, China does have a tendency sometimes to push a little hard. So one needs to make sure that the Chinese understand that that's not a good route. There's nothing good lies down that road. But that's a very far cry from saying that our objective should be to contain China or frustrate it or provoke it. So I think it's very easy to overstate. I mean, in no way do I want to say China is, no one has to think about China. It's a cipher. It's incredibly important. It's really dynamic. But if you see China the way the Chinese see it, you don't see this enormous colossus that a lot of others do.
As you and I talk early in 2012, much of American foreign policy debate concerns Iran. How threatening it is, what if anything can be done about it, how the U.S. should view military versus non-military means. What is the right way to think about Iran and its nuclear threat or non-threat?
The first thing I'd say is that the sort of mad mullah approach is probably not, does not make sense to me. I think Ahmadinejad in certain moods seems a little unbalanced, but I think he's clearly not the real power in Iran. And the real power is pretty rational calculators. I don't know whether they're good theologians, but they are pretty good at rational calculus. And so I think to start with the assumption that deterrence is not a concept that would be applied to Iran, I think is a mistake. And that would be as true on the Israeli side as more generally. On the other hand, there are some real problems with, sort of in the rational world, there are real problems with a nuclear Iran. One of them would be that a nuclear Iran is probably the end of any real serious international non-proliferation effort. That the Saudis, the Turks, I think sooner or later, a number of other people start getting bombs if the Iranians get them. And there are people who say, well, that just means, ultimately all 200 members of the UN will have nuclear weapons and everyone will be deterred. Who knows? I'd rather personally stop short of that. Obviously, the goal of our policy should be to avoid having to make that choice. And that, I think, is pretty much the policy that we see. And frankly, I think if we had a Republican president, I don't think it would be that. I think it's one of the cases where it's fairly obvious what you need to do. The price of the policy that we followed is, in order to assemble an international coalition and build the sanctions and do covert ops and whatever else is going on, the president has to really elevate this issue and say over and over again, the bomb is unacceptable, we can't accept it. Well, this pretty much paints you into a corner. You cannot go on for 5 years calling something unacceptable when your plan B is to accept it.
We're entering the lightning round phase now. I'm going to ask you about a couple of other topics and the sort of distilled way we should think of them. What's the right way to think about how to cope with Pakistan, the other impossible problem?
Well, right, as you say, it is the other impossible problem. Every time I've talked to a lot of Pakistanis, I've traveled around in Pakistan, and everywhere I go, one question that I ask is, so how do we fix Pakistan? No one knows. I've never heard a Pakistani say, I've really got the answer, and it's this, and it's very simple. And then Pakistan's vision for a post-conflict Afghanistan is, sort of Islamic extremists in league with Pakistan running the country. Well, the interesting thing is no other country in the region shares that vision. China doesn't like it, Russia doesn't like it, Kazakhstan doesn't like it, Iran doesn't. No one likes it. And so I think to the extent that the U.S. can let Pakistan understand it's not us that are preventing, Pakistan is alone in this. And I don't think it can long-term prevail in those circumstances. So we need to play gentle hardball with Pakistan. And if that, again, I think we have to get back to, it is in our strategic interest and it's important for us that Pakistan succeed. They can't, the big problem we have with them is the path they're on cannot succeed, and we would like them actually to succeed.
Here's the last policy question. How should we think about the threat of European-induced economic chaos during 2012? Basic cautious optimism or basic terror?
I think the Europeans are very, very good at keeping the bottom from falling out, but very, very bad at solving the actual problem. You know, and it is interesting. I think, again, the underlying question has always been, will Germany just give up and underwrite all the debts? And the Germans keep saying no, but then, and they mean it. And the other thing that's interesting is that you look at the negotiations over the European Fiscal Austerity Pact, and what you see is the Germans are just getting nibbled to death in these negotiations. That we must have a strong austerity pact, and it must be firm, and it must be unyielding. And then, you know, some incredibly suave French diplomat says, absolutely, for example, and then puts something in. And, you know, there's just a little bit of a loophole there. And then there's a little one over here. And meanwhile, you've got, you know, the Czechs are beginning to say, well, I'm not sure we can ratify it. And the Irish are saying, oh, I hope we don't have to have a referendum. And so you get all of this stuff going. As an American, it makes me ever more grateful for our founding fathers. As bad as our problems are and as bad as our logjam gets, we don't have a situation where every one of our 50 states can veto an act of Congress.